In 1914, the world stood on the brink of catastrophe. What began as a political assassination in Sarajevo quickly spiraled into a global conflict unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Empires clashed, alliances crumbled, and the battlefields of Europe became a nightmare of trench warfare, gas attacks, and unimaginable destruction. Millions of lives were lost as the world witnessed the horrors of modern warfare for the first time. For 4 long years, the Great War reshaped borders, toppled empires, and left scars that still haunt us today. How did it all begin? And what were the real consequences? The world of the early 20th century was a fragile powder keg, one spark away from an explosion that would change history forever. It was a time of rising nationalism, imperial ambitions, and military alliances that bound nations together in a dangerous game of politics and power. And in 1914, that game turned deadly. For decades, Europe had been divided into 2 major alliances. On one side stood the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, 3 great powers with a common enemy in Germany. On the other side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, stood prepared to defend their empires at any cost. These alliances were meant to prevent war, but instead, they ensured that if one nation fell into conflict, the rest would be dragged in as well. But alliances alone don't start wars. Tensions had been rising for years. The great powers were locked in an arms race, competing to build the biggest armies, the most powerful navies, and the deadliest weapons the world had ever seen. Meanwhile, nationalist movements were tearing apart the multi-ethnic empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, threatening to ignite revolutions from within. And then, in the summer of 1914, everything came crashing down. It began in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, angering many Serbs who believed the region rightfully belonged to Serbia. Among them was a secret society known as the Black Hand, a group of Serbian nationalists determined to strike back. That morning, as the Archduke's motorcade made its way through the crowded streets, a member of the Black Hand threw a grenade at his car. The grenade bounced off, exploding behind them and injuring several bystanders. Shaken but unharmed, Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing with his visit. But fate had other plans. Later that day, his driver took a wrong turn, and the car came to a stop right in front of one of the assassins, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. Seizing the moment, Princip pulled out a pistol and fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke in the neck, the other struck his wife, Sophie. Within minutes, they were dead. The world stood still. Austria-Hungary was outraged and blamed Serbia for the attack. Within days, they issued an ultimatum. Serbia had to accept harsh demands or face war. Serbia agreed to most of them but refused to surrender its sovereignty. Austria-Hungary was not satisfied. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. It should have been a regional conflict. But thanks to the tangled web of alliances, it became something far worse. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, demanded that Russia stand down. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. But it didn't stop there. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, was next. Germany, fearing a 2-front war, launched the infamous Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that called for a quick invasion of France by marching through Belgium. But Belgium was a neutral country, protected by an old treaty with Britain. And when Germany violated Belgium's neutrality, Britain had no choice but to step in. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. In just 1 week, Europe was engulfed in flames. The war machine had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. Soldiers boarded trains, eager for battle, believing they'd be home by Christmas. But this was no ordinary war. This was the dawn of industrialized warfare, where new weapons, brutal tactics, and unimaginable destruction would change the face of combat forever. What had started as a gunshot in Sarajevo had unleashed a global catastrophe. The Great War had begun. When war broke out in August 1914, the people of Europe greeted it with a mix of fear, excitement, and patriotic fervor. Soldiers marched through the streets, cheered on by crowds waving flags and throwing flowers. Governments assured their people that the war would be short, over by Christmas, they said. But they were wrong. What they didn't know was that the world was about to witness something far worse than anyone had imagined. This war would not be fought with honor on open battlefields, nor would it end in a swift and decisive victory. Instead, it would become a nightmare of trenches, barbed wire, and slaughter on an industrial scale. The First World War had begun, and there was no going back. Germany knew from the start that it was facing a two-front war, against Russia in the east and France in the west. To avoid being crushed between these two powers, Germany put its faith in the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that aimed to defeat France quickly before turning to fight Russia. The plan was bold. Germany would send the bulk of its army through Belgium, bypassing the heavily fortified French-German border. Once in France, German troops would sweep south, capture Paris, and force France to surrender in just 6 weeks. Then, with France out of the war, Germany would shift its forces east to take on Russia, which was expected to be slower to mobilize. On paper, it was a brilliant strategy. But in reality, it had one fatal flaw: it underestimated the resistance Germany would face in Belgium. On August 4, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, expecting little resistance. But the Belgians refused to surrender. Despite being outnumbered, they fought back fiercely, using their forts and rivers to slow the German advance. Civilians took up arms, snipers harassed German troops from rooftops, and Belgian forces even flooded entire regions to create natural barriers. This defiance enraged Germany. In response, German troops unleashed terror on the Belgian population, executing civilians, burning villages, and destroying entire towns in what became known as the Rape of Belgium. These brutal actions horrified the world and turned public opinion against Germany, particularly in Britain, which had been hesitant to enter the war. But Belgium's resistance wasn't just symbolic. It bought time for Britain and France to mobilize their forces. And it threw the Schlieffen Plan into chaos. On August 23, British forces arrived in Belgium to confront the advancing Germans. Known as the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, they were small but highly trained. Their first major battle took place at Mons, where they faced a much larger German army. Despite being outnumbered, the British fought with precision, using their rapid rifle fire to cut down German infantry by the thousands. German soldiers were shocked. They had expected a weak and disorganized British force, but instead, they were met with deadly accuracy. One German officer later described it as facing a wall of fire. But despite their bravery, the British were eventually forced to retreat. The Germans were too many, and the British had no choice but to fall back towards France. The Great Retreat had begun. As German forces pushed deeper into France, it seemed like the Schlieffen Plan was working. By early September, they were just 30 miles from Paris. The French government began evacuating, and panic spread through the city. But then, in a desperate bid to save France, the French launched a bold counterattack. On September 6, 1914, over 1 million French and British soldiers clashed with the Germans along the Marne River. This battle, known as the First Battle of the Marne, was one of the most important battles of the entire war. With no reinforcements and stretched supply lines, the Germans were forced to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The war would not end quickly. Instead, both sides dug in, building hundreds of miles of trenches, marking the beginning of the deadliest stalemate in history. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had become a nightmare of trenches, barbed wire, and endless artillery fire. Soldiers on both sides had expected a war of movement, but instead, they found themselves trapped in a frozen hell, living in muddy ditches filled with rats, disease, and the stench of death. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, creating a battlefield where progress was measured in yards, not miles. Soldiers endured constant artillery bombardments, sniper fire, and terrifying gas attacks, as both sides fought for control of no man's land, a barren wasteland between the trenches, littered with bodies and debris. Life in the trenches was a living nightmare. Soldiers spent weeks in the mud, with little food, no sleep, and the ever-present threat of being killed at any moment. They endured relentless shelling, trench foot from standing in water for days, and the terror of night raids. And yet, despite the suffering, the war continued. While the Western Front descended into a brutal stalemate, the war in the East was far more fluid. In August 1914, Germany clashed with Russia in the Battle of Tannenberg, one of the most decisive battles of the entire war. German forces, led by General Paul von Hindenburg, annihilated a much larger Russian army, capturing over 90,000 prisoners and destroying Russian morale. But the Russians weren't the only ones struggling. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, was being torn apart by the war. Its armies suffered humiliating defeats against both the Russians and the Serbs. By the end of 1914, Austria-Hungary was on the brink of collapse, forcing Germany to divert troops to support them. The war was no longer just a fight between nations, it had become a fight for survival. By the time 1914 came to a close, it was clear this war would not end quickly. The battlefields of Europe had become killing grounds where thousands died every day, and yet, no one could claim victory. The war that had begun with optimism and promises of swift triumph had become something else entirely, a war of attrition, where the goal was no longer just to win, but simply to outlast the enemy. As 1915 dawned, both sides prepared for an even bloodier year ahead. New weapons, new strategies, and new horrors awaited them. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The war had already consumed millions of lives, and yet, it was far from over. The trenches would only grow deeper. The battles would become even deadlier. And soon, new horrors would emerge, poison gas, machine guns, and the first tanks. The world had stepped into a nightmare, and there was no waking up. But how did the war evolve from trenches to total devastation? And what new weapons would change the battlefield forever? Join us in the next episode as we uncover the next chapter of World War I, the war machines of death. As the war on the Western Front raged on, the brutal stalemate between the Allies and Central Powers dug in deep into the trenches, marking the beginning of a protracted conflict that would last for years. The battlefield became a quagmire of mud, blood, and hopelessness. The conditions were appalling, and both sides were entrenched in a deadly game of attrition, where each side sought to wear the other down. The soldiers who fought in these trenches knew little of the grand strategy or the political maneuverings that led them to this point. They were simply soldiers, driven by the will to survive, to push back the enemy, or, in some cases, to merely make it through another day. Trench warfare was not only a test of physical endurance but also mental fortitude. The constant threat of death, whether from a sniper's bullet, an artillery shell, or the gas attacks that could strike without warning, took a toll on the soldiers' spirits. Life in the trenches was a harsh existence. The men lived in constant mud and filth, surrounded by the decomposing remains of fallen comrades and horses. The trenches themselves were often filled with water, creating a cold, damp environment that sapped the soldiers' energy and morale. The stench of decaying bodies, rotting food, and the fetid odor of unwashed soldiers filled the air, making it impossible to escape the grim reality of the war. Yet, in this hellish environment, there were moments of relative calm, where soldiers could rest, share stories of home, or catch a glimpse of the beauty that still existed in the world beyond the war. The early months of the war saw a high level of optimism among both the soldiers and their commanding officers. The belief that a quick, decisive victory could be achieved was widespread. However, as the fighting wore on, it became clear that this would not be a war of quick campaigns. Instead, the soldiers found themselves entrenched in the mud, engaged in a war of attrition. One of the most grueling and infamous examples of this protracted conflict was the Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1, 1916. The Allies had planned a major offensive against the Germans, hoping to break through their defenses and force a decisive end to the war. The plan was to launch a massive artillery bombardment that would soften up the German lines before sending in infantry to advance. For weeks, the Allies pounded the German defenses with shells, creating massive craters and tearing apart the landscape. The hope was that this bombardment would leave the Germans reeling, unable to mount an effective defense when the infantry attacked. However, the reality was far different. The Germans, well entrenched in their positions, were well prepared for the barrage. Their trenches were fortified, and many of their soldiers were protected by underground bunkers that shielded them from the worst of the bombardment. As the artillery fire subsided, the Allies sent in their infantry, expecting to break through the German lines. But as the soldiers advanced across no man's land, they were met with a horrifying sight. The German defenses were intact, and the soldiers were ready. The Germans unleashed a withering crossfire on the advancing Allies, cutting down wave after wave of soldiers before they could even get close to the enemy lines. The open ground of no man's land was a death trap, where soldiers had no cover and were easy targets for enemy machine guns and snipers. The Allied soldiers who managed to survive the first wave of fire were often unable to advance any further, as they were pinned down by the relentless German barrage. Many soldiers were killed instantly, while others were left to bleed out in the mud. The Battle of the Somme would go on for months, with little ground gained by either side. The casualty rates were staggering, and the soldiers who fought in the battle would carry the physical and psychological scars of the experience for the rest of their lives. The Battle of Verdun, another infamous battle of the war, was a similarly brutal experience. Fought between the Germans and the French, it became a symbol of French resolve and the devastating cost of war. The battle began in February 1916 and would last until December of that year. The Germans launched a massive offensive against the French, hoping to bleed them dry and force them to surrender. Verdun was strategically significant because of its location along the front lines and its symbolic importance to the French. The Germans believed that if they could capture Verdun, they would break the French spirit and deal a devastating blow to the Allied cause. The French, however, were determined not to give up the city. Verdun became a symbol of national pride, and the French soldiers, led by General Philippe Pétain, vowed to hold the city at all costs. The battle that followed was one of the most catastrophic in history. Both sides unleashed artillery bombardments that tore apart the landscape, creating craters that swallowed entire units. The soldiers who fought in Verdun were subjected to constant shelling, with little respite. Many soldiers were trapped in the trenches, unable to escape the barrage or retreat. The constant fear of death from artillery shells or gas attacks made it impossible for soldiers to rest or recover. In the midst of this chaos, the soldiers of both sides showed remarkable resilience. The French soldiers, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, held their positions, fighting to the last man. The Germans, for their part, were equally determined to break the French line, and the battle became a war of attrition, with neither side willing to give an inch. The fighting at Verdun was characterized by its unrelenting brutality, with soldiers subjected to constant bombardments and attacks. The soldiers who survived the battle would never be the same again. Many were physically scarred, suffering from injuries caused by artillery fire, gas attacks, and the brutal conditions in the trenches. Others were mentally shattered by the horrors they had witnessed, suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. As the war continued into 1917, the toll on both the soldiers and the civilian population was becoming unbearable. The global conflict, which had initially been thought of as a short-lived affair, was now entering its third year. The initial hopes of a quick victory had long faded, replaced by a grim reality of unyielding trench warfare, technological advancements in weaponry, and mounting casualties. The war had spread beyond Europe, pulling in nations from all corners of the world, but the Western Front, in particular, remained the epicenter of the battle. In the trenches, life had become a relentless struggle for survival, with little hope of respite. While the soldiers were entrenched in mud and violence, the strategies of war were beginning to evolve. The Allies, particularly the British and French forces, began to realize that conventional tactics of mass infantry assaults would no longer suffice. The use of artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire created insurmountable obstacles that made frontal attacks deadly and futile. As a result, commanders were forced to explore new methods of breaking the stalemate, leading to the development and deployment of new weapons and tactics that would alter the course of the war. One of the most significant innovations was the tank, a hulking metal beast that seemed to defy the traditional nature of battle. The British were the first to deploy tanks in battle, and the sight of these armored vehicles rumbling across no man's land sent shockwaves through the enemy. The tanks were designed to crush barbed wire, traverse trenches, and withstand the deadly barrage of machine gun and artillery fire. They were a response to the gridlocked conditions of trench warfare and represented a new era in mechanized warfare. However, the first use of tanks in the Battle of the Somme in 1916 was less than successful. Many of the tanks broke down, while others became stuck in the mud or were destroyed by artillery fire. Nevertheless, the potential of the tank was clear, and as the war continued, its design and effectiveness improved. By the time of the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, tanks had become a potent force on the battlefield. Yet, despite the introduction of tanks and other innovations, the war still had a familiar, devastating pattern. The British and French forces, despite the occasional breakthrough, struggled to maintain consistent progress against the entrenched German positions. The battle lines remained static for the most part, with the soldiers in the trenches enduring conditions that could only be described as hellish. The constant barrage of artillery shells, the ever-present threat of poison gas attacks, and the fatigue that came with years of near-constant combat took a heavy toll on the men in the front lines. In the midst of this chaos, the battle for Verdun continued to rage. The Germans had launched a massive offensive in February 1916, hoping to bleed the French army dry by forcing them to fight in a prolonged and exhausting battle. Verdun was of immense strategic and symbolic importance to the French. It was a historic city, and the French leadership knew that losing it would deal a fatal blow to their morale. The French soldiers, under the leadership of General Philippe Pétain, vowed to defend the city at all costs. The Battle of Verdun became a symbol of the war's brutal and unrelenting nature. For months, both sides exchanged devastating artillery fire. The landscape around Verdun was torn apart, and the trenches became a labyrinth of mud and destruction. Soldiers were subjected to near-constant shelling, and the battlefield was littered with the bodies of the fallen. The use of poison gas, which had been introduced earlier in the war, became more widespread during the battle, adding a new and terrifying dimension to the fighting. The French, though outnumbered and overwhelmed, managed to hold on to Verdun, but the cost was staggering. Over 700,000 soldiers were either killed or wounded during the battle, making it one of the deadliest encounters of the entire war. Meanwhile, in Russia, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Russian Empire had entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1914, but by 1917 it was clear that the Russian forces were struggling to keep up. The Russian army was ill-equipped, poorly led, and lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged war. In the harsh winter months, soldiers often fought with inadequate clothing and gear, and food and supplies were in short supply. The Russian people, too, had grown weary of the war, and discontent was brewing. Protests and strikes erupted in the streets of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, demanding an end to the war and better living conditions. The Russian Revolution of 1917 would have a profound impact on the course of World War I. In February of that year, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, and the Russian monarchy came to an end. A provisional government was established, but it was unable to address the mounting crisis. The soldiers, many of whom had been fighting in the trenches for years, were increasingly unwilling to continue the fight. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution. The new Bolshevik government immediately sought to withdraw Russia from the war. The signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 effectively ended Russia's involvement in the conflict, freeing up German forces to move to the Western Front. This turn of events shifted the balance of power on the battlefield. The German High Command, bolstered by the influx of troops from the east, launched a series of offensives in the spring of 1918, hoping to break the deadlock and secure victory before American forces, who had begun to arrive in Europe in large numbers, could tip the balance in favor of the Allies. The German spring offensives, which included attacks at St. Quentin, Amiens, and the Somme, initially achieved some success. The Germans advanced deep into Allied territory, and it seemed as though the tide of the war might turn in their favor. However, the German advances were unsustainable. The Allied forces, now reinforced by fresh American troops and supplies, mounted a determined defense. The newly deployed tanks, better artillery tactics, and effective use of air support helped to blunt the German advances. In July 1918, the Allies launched a counter-offensive, pushing the Germans back and regaining much of the territory that had been lost in the spring. By the fall of 1918, the German army was in full retreat, and the war was all but lost for the Central Powers. The signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, marked the end of the fighting, but the war had taken an enormous toll. Over 10 million soldiers had been killed, and an estimated 20 million had been wounded. Civilian casualties were also staggering, with millions more dying from famine, disease, and the indirect effects of the war. The world would never be the same again. The political landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered, with empires collapsing and new nations emerging from the ashes of the old order. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, would officially end the war and impose heavy reparations on Germany, setting the stage for future conflict. The closing months of 1918 saw the world-changing events unfold at a rapid pace. The war that had once seemed like an unyielding, eternal conflict was finally nearing its bitter conclusion. As the Allies pushed forward on all fronts, the Central Powers, particularly Germany, found themselves in a position of desperate retreat. But despite their weakening hold on the battlefield, the political landscape of Europe was shifting in ways that would have far-reaching consequences. In the trenches, the soldiers had long learned to endure the hardships of warfare, the constant shelling, the gas attacks, the endless marches, and the psychological trauma. But as the fall of 1918 approached, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that the end was near. The German military machine, which had once been so dominant, was beginning to show cracks. The soldiers, already demoralized from years of brutal combat, saw their commanders struggling to maintain control of an increasingly volatile situation. The supply lines were stretched thin, food and ammunition were running low, and desertions were becoming more frequent. On the Western Front, the Allies, bolstered by the fresh troops and supplies pouring in from the United States, launched a series of offensives that would ultimately break the back of the German army. The first of these offensives, the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, was a resounding success. The British and French forces, supported by American troops, employed new tactics that combined infantry, tanks, and air support. The Allies used coordinated artillery barrages to pound the German positions, followed by rapid advances of infantry and tanks. The Germans, taken by surprise, were forced to retreat, marking the beginning of a rapid decline in their fortunes. The Battle of Amiens was the beginning of a series of offensives known as the 100 Days Offensive, which would push the Germans back and eventually lead to their surrender. As the Allies gained ground, the Germans tried to hold their position, but their ability to resist had been severely weakened. The once mighty German army, exhausted and stretched thin, began to crumble under the pressure. The Allies continued to advance, pushing through towns and villages that had long been held by the Germans. In the face of mounting defeats, the German High Command began to acknowledge that victory was no longer possible. In early October 1918, the German government sent a delegation to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. The Germans were hoping for a negotiated peace, one that would allow them to avoid the humiliating terms of a total defeat. But the Allies, having witnessed the immense suffering caused by the war, were unwilling to offer any leniency. The Allies, led by French Premier Georges Clemenceau and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, were determined to secure a peace that would leave Germany weakened and ensure that it could not wage another war in the future. The political climate in Germany was equally unstable. The German people, weary of the war and disillusioned by their government's handling of the conflict, began to demand change. Strikes and protests broke out across the country, and the revolutionary fervor that had already taken hold in Russia spread to Germany. The workers, soldiers, and sailors, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, were calling for an end to the war and a new government. In response to the growing unrest, Kaiser Wilhelm II, The German emperor abdicated in early November 1918, and the German Empire collapsed. The new Weimar Republic was established, but it faced immediate challenges. The revolution that had begun with the abdication of the Kaiser did not end with the formation of the new government. Political and social unrest continued to plague Germany in the years following the war, setting the stage for the rise of extremist movements, including the Nazis. The final days of the war were marked by intense fighting, even as both sides knew that victory was within reach. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice was signed, effectively ending the fighting. The soldiers on the front lines, who had fought and suffered for so long, were ecstatic, yet the joy was mixed with a sense of disbelief. After 4 years of horrific conflict, it was over. But for many, the end of the fighting did not bring an end to their suffering. The physical and psychological scars of war would remain with the soldiers for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath of the armistice, the world began to reckon with the staggering consequences of the war. The human cost was unfathomable. Millions of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and civilian casualties were equally devastating. Whole generations of men had been lost, and entire families and communities had been shattered. The economies of the combatant nations were in ruins, and the social fabric of Europe had been torn apart. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, officially ended the war, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. The treaty, which imposed harsh reparations and territorial losses on Germany, was viewed by many Germans as a dictated peace that humiliated their country. The terms of the treaty were designed to punish Germany and ensure that it would never be able to start another war. But the treaty's punitive measures only deepened the resentment and anger felt by the German people, creating fertile ground for the rise of radical ideologies. In France, the memory of the war's devastation led to a deep sense of mistrust and fear of future conflict. The country had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front, and the wounds of the war were still fresh. French soldiers and civilians alike had endured unimaginable hardships, and the collective trauma of the war was felt across the nation. The political leaders of the time were focused on rebuilding the country and preventing another war, but the scars of the conflict would not heal easily. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged from the war as a world power, but the American experience of the war was different from that of the European nations. While the US had suffered losses in terms of soldiers' lives, it had been less directly affected by the devastation of the war. The United States was economically stronger than ever, and its leaders sought to establish a new global order based on peace and cooperation. However, the US was unwilling to fully embrace the League of Nations, the international organization that was created by the Treaty of Versailles to prevent future conflicts. The Senate rejected the US's involvement in the League, citing concerns over American sovereignty and the potential for future entanglements in foreign wars. With the signing of the armistice in November 1918, the war officially ended, but the aftermath would prove to be a much longer struggle for the nations involved. The armistice brought relief to the soldiers who had fought for years in the trenches, but it also left behind a world deeply scarred by the horrors of war. The political, economic, and social ramifications of World War I would reverberate across the globe for decades to come. What followed was not just a peace settlement, but a complex web of consequences that reshaped the course of history. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was intended to bring closure to the war and to establish a framework for lasting peace. However, the treaty's harsh terms would sow the seeds of future conflict. Germany, which had been one of the central powers in the conflict, was made to bear the full blame for the war. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed responsibility for the war squarely on Germany's shoulders, a move that was deeply resented by the German population and leadership. In addition to the moral and psychological weight of the clause, the treaty imposed heavy reparations on Germany, demanding that the country pay for the destruction caused during the war. The economic impact of these reparations was devastating for Germany, plunging the country into a period of extreme hardship. Territorially, Germany was forced to surrender large portions of its empire. Colonies in Africa and the Pacific were seized by the victorious powers, and significant land was taken from the German heartland. The Saar region was placed under French control, and the city of Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, was declared a free city, effectively removing it from German jurisdiction. Perhaps the most damaging territorial loss for Germany was the dismantling of its eastern territories, which were ceded to the newly created states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and others. The loss of these lands caused significant economic disruption, as well as a sense of national humiliation. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Treaty of Versailles was the limitation placed on Germany's military. The treaty imposed severe restrictions on the size and strength of the German army. The country was only allowed a standing army of 100,000 men, far smaller than the one it had maintained during the war. The German Air Force was abolished entirely, and the country was forbidden from having tanks, submarines, or warships. This was intended to prevent any future German military aggression, but it also left the country vulnerable to the rise of extremist movements that would later exploit the sense of injustice and resentment that lingered in the aftermath of the treaty. The punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles did little to ensure lasting peace. Instead, it bred anger and resentment in Germany, where many felt the terms were excessively harsh and unfair. The war guilt clause, in particular, was seen as an insult, as it ignored the complex causes of the war and placed the blame solely on Germany's shoulders. The treaty's economic provisions crippled Germany's economy, leading to hyperinflation and widespread poverty. In the early 1920s, the country experienced a period of extreme economic instability marked by the collapse of the mark, Germany's currency, which became virtually worthless. This economic turmoil, combined with the humiliation of the treaty, contributed to a growing sense of dissatisfaction and disillusionment among the German people. In this environment of political and economic instability, extremist movements began to gain traction. The most notable of these was the rise of the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. The Nazi Party capitalized on the widespread resentment toward the Treaty of Versailles and the economic hardship that many Germans were enduring. Hitler promised to restore Germany's honor, undo the provisions of the treaty, and rebuild the nation's military strength. His rhetoric of national pride and vengeance resonated with many Germans, who were desperate for change. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had grown into a powerful political force, and in 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. In the years following World War I, the rest of Europe also struggled to rebuild. France, which had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front, was left with vast swathes of its countryside destroyed and an economy crippled by the war. The human cost of the conflict was incalculable, with millions of soldiers and civilians killed, wounded, or displaced. The emotional and psychological scars of the war were deep, and the French people were left grappling with the loss of so many young men who had been wiped out in the trenches. The impact of the war was also felt across the Atlantic. The United States, which had entered the war in 1917, had emerged as a global power. However, despite its military and economic strength, the US was reluctant to fully embrace the role of world leader. In the aftermath of the war, the United States turned inward, rejecting the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Many Americans were weary of European entanglements and preferred to focus on domestic concerns, such as economic recovery and the implementation of the policies that would define the Roaring Twenties. Despite its reluctance to join the League of Nations, the US played a key role in shaping the post-war world. American President Woodrow Wilson had been one of the main proponents of the League, and his vision of a new world order based on collective security and international cooperation had influenced the design of the peace settlement. However, the absence of the United States from the League of Nations weakened the organization's ability to maintain peace and resolve conflicts. The League's inability to address rising tensions in the 1920s and 1930s would prove to be one of its greatest failures, and by the time World War II broke out, the League had effectively ceased to be a functioning entity. The interwar period was a time of political and social upheaval. In Germany, the Weimar Republic struggled to maintain stability in the face of economic hardship and political extremism. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already come to power in 1922, establishing the first fascist regime in Europe. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Bolsheviks had established the Soviet Union, and the world was witnessing the rise of communism as an alternative to capitalism and democracy. The economic turmoil of the 1920s and 1930s, particularly the Great Depression, created fertile ground for the spread of these ideologies, which promised to offer solutions to the problems of the time. As the world grappled with the aftermath of World War I, the struggle for stability continued, particularly in the newly established Weimar Republic in Germany. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles had dealt a devastating blow to the German Empire, and the sense of humiliation and anger among the German population only deepened as the terms of the treaty became clear. The economic and political upheaval that followed the end of the war set the stage for the turbulent years that would shape the interwar period. The German people, already weary from the horrors of 4 years of warfare, now found themselves in a battle for their future. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919, was intended to be a democratic solution to the political crisis that had followed the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. But the fledgling republic faced an uphill struggle from the very beginning. It was born out of the ashes of war, and its legitimacy was constantly challenged by right-wing nationalists, left-wing revolutionaries, and the deep sense of betrayal that many Germans felt in the wake of their country's defeat. The new government, led by the Social Democrats, struggled to maintain control in a country torn apart by economic hardship, social unrest, and political extremism. The economic situation in Germany was dire. The war had left the country in ruins, and the burden of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles only compounded the problems. Hyperinflation gripped the country in the early 1920s, and the German mark became virtually worthless. People were forced to carry wheelbarrows full of paper money to buy basic goods, as prices skyrocketed and savings were wiped out. The middle class, which had once been the backbone of German society, found itself destitute, while the working class struggled to survive on meager wages. The economic chaos created a fertile ground for extremist movements, both on the right and the left. One of the most prominent right-wing groups to rise in this environment was the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. The Nazis were able to exploit the widespread dissatisfaction with the Weimar Republic and its handling of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's message of national renewal, his promise to restore Germany's honor, and his radical anti-Semitic and nationalist rhetoric resonated with many Germans who felt betrayed by their leaders. The Nazis were not alone in their opposition to the Weimar Republic. The German Communist Party, KPD, also sought to seize power and establish a Soviet-style government. The political instability was exacerbated by violent clashes between the communist and Nazi factions, each vying for control. The left-wing and right-wing groups were not the only forces challenging the authority of the Weimar government. In the early 1920s, the country was rocked by a series of uprisings and attempted coups. The most famous of these was the Kapp Putsch in 1920, a failed attempt by right-wing military officers and politicians to overthrow the Weimar government. The putsch was crushed, but it highlighted the fragile nature of the republic and the extent to which the German military, which had once been a powerful force during the war, was still capable of influencing political events. In the years following the failed putsch, the Weimar Republic continued to face political and social challenges. The Treaty of Versailles remained a deeply divisive issue, and the Republic's legitimacy was constantly undermined by the sense of betrayal felt by many Germans. The country's defeat in World War I had shattered its sense of national pride, and the harsh terms of the peace settlement only deepened the wounds. As a result, extremist political movements gained traction, and the Republic was unable to effectively address the growing divisions within German society. The turning point came in the early 1930s, when the global economic depression hit Germany with devastating force. The Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered a worldwide economic collapse, and Germany, which was already suffering from the burden of reparations and inflation, was hit hardest. Unemployment soared, poverty spread, and the social fabric of German society began to unravel. The Weimar government's inability to cope with the economic crisis led to widespread dissatisfaction, and the Nazi Party seized upon this discontent. Hitler and the Nazis portrayed themselves as the only solution to Germany's problems, promising to restore national pride, rebuild the economy, and eliminate the threats posed by communism and the perceived Jewish influence in German society. The Nazis promised to undo the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild Germany's military might. Hitler's rhetoric struck a chord with many Germans who had lost faith in the Weimar government and felt that their country had been humiliated by the international community. By 1932, the Nazis had become a major political force in Germany. In the elections of that year, they gained significant ground, winning millions of votes. Despite their growing popularity, Hitler was not yet in power. The Nazi Party still lacked a majority in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, and many political elites were wary of Hitler's radical ideas. However, they underestimated the extent of his popularity and the strength of his political machine. In January 1933, after a series of backroom deals and political maneuvering, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. The Nazi Party, which had once been on the fringes of German politics, now controlled the government. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to consolidate his control. He used the Reichstag fire of February 1933 as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed the Nazis to arrest and imprison their political opponents. With the help of the Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, Hitler gained dictatorial powers, effectively ending democracy in Germany and establishing a totalitarian regime. The rise of the Nazis was a direct consequence of the political instability and economic hardship that had plagued Germany since the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, with its harsh reparations and territorial losses, had created a climate of resentment and frustration that the Nazis were able to exploit. The failure of the Weimar Republic to address the economic crisis and the social divisions within Germany allowed extremist political movements to gain power. The election of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in history, one that would lead to the outbreak of World War II and the atrocities of the Holocaust. As the political chaos of the interwar years unfolded, one of the central figures who would emerge as a driving force in shaping the world's future was Adolf Hitler. The discontent and frustration that had been seeded in Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, combined with the dire economic conditions following the Great Depression, created the perfect environment for radical ideologies to take root. Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, capitalized on this discontent, offering a vision of national renewal, pride, and vengeance against the perceived injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. From the moment Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, he wasted no time in consolidating his power. Through a series of calculated political moves and the use of intimidation and violence, the Nazis quickly dismantled the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic. The Reichstag fire of February 1933 was a turning point. Hitler exploited the fire, which was blamed on communists, as an excuse to push through the Reichstag fire decree, granting him emergency powers to arrest political opponents, suppress opposition, and eliminate civil liberties. The decree marked the beginning of the Nazi Party's violent and authoritarian rule. In March 1933, Hitler secured further power with the passage of the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial authority. With this legislation, Hitler was able to bypass the Reichstag and pass laws without parliamentary approval, effectively rendering the legislative body irrelevant. With the Weimar Republic now effectively abolished, Germany was transformed into a one-party state under the totalitarian rule of the Nazis. Hitler's grip on power tightened further as he systematically eliminated any opposition to his regime, from political rivals to members of other political parties, journalists, and intellectuals. The rise of Nazi Germany was marked by an aggressive agenda that sought to overturn the post-World War I order and to restore Germany to its former greatness. Hitler's foreign policy was built on the belief that Germany had been wronged by the Treaty of Versailles and deserved to reclaim its lost territories, military might, and status as a world power. His ambitions for expansionism and the idea of a racially pure Aryan state would soon lead the world into another catastrophic conflict. In the years following his rise to power, Hitler's foreign policy took a series of increasingly bold and dangerous steps. His first major move was the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was prohibited from maintaining a military presence in the Rhineland, a region of western Germany that bordered France. The reoccupation of the Rhineland was a direct violation of the treaty, but it went unchallenged by France or Britain. This moment marked the beginning of the policy of appeasement, where the major powers of Europe, hoping to avoid another war, allowed Hitler to expand German territory without significant opposition. Hitler's aggressive moves did not stop with the Rhineland. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, claiming it was the reunification of the German-speaking peoples. This move was widely popular within Germany, but it raised alarm bells in neighboring countries. Despite this, Austria's annexation was met with little resistance from other European powers. In the same year, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. The Munich Agreement, signed by Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. This agreement, hailed by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain as securing peace for our time, was a tragic example of the policy of appeasement at its most misguided. It was clear that Hitler's ambitions were not going to be stopped by diplomatic concessions. By 1939, Hitler had successfully expanded German territory through a series of aggressive maneuvers, and the major powers of Europe had been either unwilling or unable to stop him. The appeasement of Hitler, coupled with the failure of the League of Nations to act as a force for peace, created a climate of uncertainty and fear across Europe. Meanwhile, the German dictator was preparing for his ultimate goal, the conquest of Poland and the establishment of a vast empire in Eastern Europe. On September 1, 1939, Hitler's forces invaded Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. The invasion was swift and brutal, with Germany employing its new tactics of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which combined fast-moving mechanized infantry, artillery, and airstrikes to overwhelm the enemy. Within weeks, Poland was defeated, and its territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, in accordance with the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The invasion of Poland triggered Britain and France to declare war on Germany, officially starting World War II. However, the scale of the war and the rapid advance of German forces would soon leave these two countries struggling to keep pace with the Nazi onslaught. The initial success of Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics led to the swift conquest of much of Western Europe, including France, which fell in the summer of 1940. By the end of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled most of continental Europe, and Hitler's ambitions seemed unstoppable. While the early years of the war were marked by military victories for Nazi Germany, the reality of a two-front war soon began to take its toll. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, would prove to be a disastrous decision that stretched Germany's resources thin and led to heavy losses on the Eastern Front. The harsh Russian winter and the determination of Soviet resistance turned the tide against the German forces, and the Eastern Front would remain a brutal and costly battlefield for the remainder of the war. On the Western Front, the entry of the United States into the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shifted the balance of power. The US, with its industrial might and vast resources, played a key role in turning the tide against Germany. The Allied forces, which included the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, began to push back against the German occupation of Europe. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from 1942 to 1943, marked a turning point in the war, as the German Sixth Army was surrounded and defeated by the Soviet Red Army. Stage for the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. The events of World War II unfolded with breathtaking speed and brutality. As Germany's military juggernaut continued its march across Europe, the world watched in shock as Hitler's vision of an empire stretched across the continent. Yet, despite initial success and rapid conquests, the tide of war was beginning to shift. The entry of the United States into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 not only boosted the morale of the Allies but also brought with it immense industrial and military capabilities that would prove to be a turning point. The United States had been cautious about entering the conflict, with the majority of its citizens and political leaders preferring to remain neutral, wary of becoming embroiled in another European war. However, the Japanese attack on the Pacific Fleet, followed by Germany's declaration of war on the US shortly after Japan's actions, changed the equation. With the US now officially involved in the conflict, a new front opened up in the war, one that would forever alter the dynamics of the global struggle. The industrial capabilities of the United States, with its vast factories and abundant resources, provided the Allies with much-needed supplies, from weapons and ammunition to aircraft and tanks. The US became known as the arsenal of democracy, producing war materials at an unprecedented rate. The sheer scale of American production was staggering. The US built more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, along with countless ships, trucks, and artillery pieces. This industrial might gave the Allies a significant advantage, and the war began to tip in their favor. In Europe, the conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union continued to rage. Operation Barbarossa, launched by Hitler in June 1941, had initially appeared to be a success, as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory. The Battle of Stalingrad, however, would become a pivotal moment in the war. By the fall of 1942, the German Sixth Army, which had been advancing toward the Soviet city, found itself encircled by Soviet forces. The battle that ensued was brutal, with casualties on both sides reaching staggering numbers. Ultimately, the German forces were forced to surrender in February 1943, marking a decisive victory for the Soviet Union. Stalingrad was not only a military defeat for Germany but also a psychological blow. The loss shattered the myth of German invincibility and exposed the limits of Hitler's strategic vision. The battle also marked the beginning of a prolonged Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually push German forces back across Eastern Europe and into the heart of Germany itself. The German retreat from Stalingrad was the beginning of a long series of defeats for Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, and it set the stage for the eventual fall of the Third Reich. On the Western Front, the tide of war was also beginning to turn against the Axis powers. In June 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, also known as D-Day. More than 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in what would become one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. The operation, which began on June 6, 1944, was a pivotal moment in the war. It allowed the Allies to establish a foothold in Western Europe and begin the liberation of France from German occupation. The success of D-Day was a critical blow to Nazi Germany. Not only did it open up a second front in Europe, but it also forced Hitler to divide his resources, fighting wars on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The Allies, now with a foothold in France, began to advance rapidly through Western Europe, liberating countries that had been under German control for years. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, was a desperate attempt to halt the Allied advance, but it ultimately failed. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were closing in on Berlin from the west, while Soviet forces approached from the east. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, the United States had been engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign to retake territory from the Japanese. The Battle of Midway in 1942 had been a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and tipping the balance of naval power in favor of the United States. From that point onward, Japan was on the defensive, with U.S. forces advancing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. Battles such as the Battle of Iwo Jima and the Battle of Okinawa were marked by fierce fighting and heavy casualties, but they paved the way for the final assault on Japan itself. The Allies' successes on both fronts were accompanied by the mounting horrors of the war's final months. In Germany, the reality of Hitler's war machine was beginning to unravel. The concentration camps, where millions of Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, and others were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, were liberated by Allied forces as they advanced. The atrocities committed by the Nazis were exposed to the world, and the full scale of the genocide began to emerge. The end of the war in Europe was imminent, and with it came the hope of bringing justice to the perpetrators of the war's most horrific crimes. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Berlin, and the final assault on the Nazi capital began. Adolf Hitler, unwilling to face defeat, took his own life in his bunker on April 30, 1945. His death marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime. On May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allied forces, bringing an end to the war in Europe. But the war was far from over. The United States, determined to avoid a costly invasion of Japan, had begun to develop a new weapon that would change the course of history, the atomic bomb. After successful tests in the desert of New Mexico in July 1945, the United States prepared to use the bomb against Japan. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands of civilians. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, and officially bringing an end to World War II. As the ashes of World War II settled, the world found itself in a fragile and uncertain state. While the defeat of the Axis powers brought an end to the most devastating conflict in human history, it also set the stage for new tensions that would divide the world for much of the 20th century. The two remaining superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged from the war as dominant forces, but they were now ideological rivals. The war had revealed the limits of cooperation between these two powers, and as peace began to take hold, the seeds of a new and even more perilous conflict were sown. The uneasy alliance between the US and the Soviet Union, which had been forged out of necessity during the war, quickly unraveled as both nations began to assert their influence in Europe and beyond. At the heart of the post-war division was a fundamental ideological clash. The United States, with its capitalist, democratic ideals, sought to spread the influence of democracy and free market capitalism around the world. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, championed communism, a system built on state control of the economy and the establishment of a classless society. The first major flashpoint in this emerging Cold War came in Eastern Europe. As the Soviet Red Army had pushed back the German forces in the east, they had established control over much of Central and Eastern Europe, including countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. While the Western Allies had hoped these nations would eventually become democratic, Stalin's regime was determined to create a buffer zone of pro-Soviet states in Eastern Europe. By the end of the war, Stalin had already begun to consolidate power in these nations, effectively creating a Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was seen by the United States and its Western allies as a betrayal of the wartime promises made at conferences such as Yalta and Potsdam. In these meetings, the Allies had discussed the post-war order with assurances from Stalin that free elections would be held in the countries liberated by Soviet forces. However, Stalin had no intention of allowing true democratic governance in these regions. Instead, he installed communist governments that were loyal to Moscow, effectively creating what would later be known as the Eastern Bloc. In response to this Soviet expansion, the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, adopted a policy known as containment. The goal of containment was to prevent the spread of communism and Soviet influence, particularly in Europe, where the Soviets had already gained a foothold. This policy led to the implementation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which committed the United States to supporting any nation that was threatened by communism either through military or economic aid. At the same time, the United States began to offer economic assistance to Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. Named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall, this plan aimed to rebuild the economies of war-torn Europe and prevent the spread of communism by providing much-needed financial support. The Marshall Plan was highly successful, helping to stabilize Western European economies and foster closer ties between the US and the nations of Western Europe. The Soviet Union, however, viewed these American actions with suspicion and hostility. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, a city that was located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany but was divided into sectors controlled by the Allies. The Berlin blockade was an attempt by Stalin to force the Allies out of Berlin and to cut off access to the city. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation in which they flew supplies into West Berlin for nearly a year, ultimately breaking the blockade and securing the city for the West. The Berlin blockade was one of the first major crises of the Cold War, and it set the stage for the long-running rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. By 1949, the world was deeply divided into two hostile camps. On one side stood the United States and its allies, who formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949 as a military alliance to counter the threat posed by the Soviet Union. On the other side, the Soviet Union responded by consolidating its control over Eastern Europe and establishing the Warsaw Pact in 1955, a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe. As tensions between the two superpowers escalated, the Cold War quickly spread beyond Europe, creating a global struggle for influence. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was a direct result of the ideological conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. In Korea, the Communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, clashed with the pro-Western South, which was backed by the United States and its allies. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided at the 38th parallel, but it marked a significant chapter in the Cold War, highlighting the global nature of the conflict. The Cold War also brought about a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations sought to develop increasingly powerful weapons, culminating in the development of nuclear bombs. The threat of nuclear war loomed over the world, as both sides developed arsenals capable of destroying each other and the planet itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was perhaps the closest the world came to nuclear war, as the Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. The crisis was resolved diplomatically, but it left a lasting impact on global relations and underscored the dangers of the nuclear age. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union also engaged in a bitter competition for technological and ideological supremacy. The space race, which began in the late 1950s, was one of the most visible aspects of this competition. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit, marking a stunning victory for the Soviet space program. The United States responded by establishing NASA and accelerating its own space efforts. In 1969, the US achieved a remarkable triumph with the Apollo 11 mission, landing the first humans on the Moon. The Moon landing was not just a scientific achievement, but also a symbolic victory in the Cold War, demonstrating American technological superiority. By the 1980s, the Cold War had entered a new phase, marked by intense rivalry but also by the prospect of détente. After decades of military posturing, proxy wars, and nuclear brinkmanship, both the United States and the Soviet Union began to feel the weight of the prolonged conflict. The arms race, the financial burden of maintaining massive military forces, and the ideologically driven struggle had left both superpowers exhausted, and their resources strained. For the Soviet Union, economic stagnation and political dysfunction were starting to show cracks in the facade of its totalitarian regime, while the United States was beginning to face its own internal challenges, including rising domestic tensions and the pressures of leading a global Cold War. At the forefront of the Soviet Union's struggle was the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who took power in 1985. Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, recognized that the Soviet Union could not sustain its current trajectory. He understood that the nation's rigid political and economic systems needed significant reforms to cope with the mounting challenges. With the policy of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, Gorbachev aimed to revitalize the Soviet state, allowing greater political freedoms and attempting to modernize the economy. Glasnost, in particular, allowed for increased freedom of expression, greater transparency in government, and the airing of social and political grievances that had been suppressed under previous leaders. However, these reforms proved to be a double-edged sword. While they allowed the Soviet people to voice their frustrations, they also unleashed a wave of dissent that the government was unable to control. The Soviet Union had been a tightly controlled, authoritarian state for decades, and Gorbachev's reforms were seen as both a breath of fresh air and a threat to the established order. In Eastern Europe, where Soviet control was the strongest, the winds of change were also beginning to blow. The dissatisfaction with communist rule had been simmering for years, but now, under Gorbachev's reforms, the people of countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia began to demand change. In Poland, the trade union Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, had already been challenging the communist regime since the early 1980s. In 1989, under the pressure of both internal unrest and the broader movement for democratic reforms sweeping Eastern Europe, the Polish government agreed to hold partially free elections. Solidarity emerged victorious, and the regime was forced to concede significant political power to the opposition. The success of Solidarity marked the beginning of the end for Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The events in Poland set off a domino effect in neighboring countries. In Hungary, the government began to loosen its grip on power, and in Czechoslovakia, mass protests led by the Civic Forum forced the resignation of the Communist Party leadership. As Eastern Europe erupted in a wave of democratic revolutions, the Soviet Union's ability to maintain control over its satellite states evaporated. Gorbachev, under increasing pressure at home, was unwilling to use military force to suppress the uprisings, as the Soviet Union had done in the past. This marked a significant departure from the aggressive policies of earlier Soviet leaders, such as Leonid Brezhnev, who had invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 to quell the Prague Spring. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of the end of Soviet control over Eastern Europe came in 1989, when the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin for nearly 3 decades, was torn down. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the physical collapse of a barrier, it was the collapse of the very ideology that had sustained it. It represented the triumph of the democratic ideals of the West over the oppressive regime of the Soviet East. Crowds of jubilant Berliners gathered to celebrate the destruction of the wall, a moment of unity that heralded the reunification of Germany and the broader collapse of the Soviet Empire. The fall of the Berlin Wall was followed by a wave of democratization across Eastern Europe. In countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania, long-standing communist regimes were overthrown, and governments were replaced by pro-Western democratic forces. For the Soviet Union, the loss of its Eastern European allies was a devastating blow. The once mighty empire was crumbling under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the pressures of external events. At home, Gorbachev's reforms had not delivered the hoped-for economic recovery. The Soviet economy, already burdened by inefficiency and stagnation, was further destabilized by the costs of the war in Afghanistan and the continuing arms race with the United States. The economic situation was compounded by the growing ethnic and nationalist tensions within the Soviet republics. The Soviet Union was a multinational state, and Gorbachev's attempts at political reform, combined with a decline in the central government's authority, sparked a wave of secessionist movements. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, many of the republics that made up the Soviet Union began to demand independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were the first to declare their independence in 1990, and other republics soon followed suit. Gorbachev, while supporting some reforms, was unwilling to allow the complete disintegration of the Soviet Union. However, his attempts to maintain the Union only deepened the political crisis. In August 1991, a group of hardline Soviet officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev in an effort to restore the traditional order of Soviet rule. The coup was a failure, but it accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus formally declared the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the USSR officially ceased to exist. The end of the Soviet Union was a seismic event in world history. The Cold War, which had defined international relations for much of the 20th century, was officially over. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, and the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism seemed to have reached a definitive conclusion. The world entered a new era, marked by the spread of democracy and market-oriented reforms in many former communist countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not only a political and ideological shift, it also had profound consequences for the people of the former USSR. Following the tension-filled summer of 1914, the world was quickly plunged into the horrors of World War I. What had begun as a series of diplomatic crises escalated rapidly into a full-blown conflict. The alliance system, which had been put in place over the past few decades as a means of preventing war, now set in motion a chain reaction that brought together some of the world's most powerful nations. In the span of just a few weeks, the political landscape of Europe, and indeed the world, was irreversibly transformed. After Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in late July 1914, the complex system of alliances began to unfold. Russia, as an ally of Serbia, mobilized its forces in defense of the Slavic nation. In response, Germany declared war on Russia. Germany's military strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, called for a rapid attack on France, hoping to avoid a two-front war by defeating France before focusing on Russia. Germany's invasion of Belgium, in order to bypass French defenses, brought the United Kingdom into the war, as Britain had a treaty to defend Belgium's neutrality. In a matter of days, the war spread across Europe, and soon, the conflict would expand into other parts of the world as the major powers' colonial holdings became embroiled in the fighting. Germany's declaration of war on France and Belgium, along with Britain's subsequent entry into the conflict, meant that Europe was in a state of all-out war. But what happened on the battlefield in those initial months was nothing short of chaotic. The German army, which was one of the best trained and equipped in the world, advanced rapidly through Belgium and into France. However, the speed of their advance soon stalled at the Battle of the Marne in early September 1914. Here, the French and British forces, despite being outnumbered, managed to halt the German momentum. The result was a deadlock that would shape much of the war. The conflict quickly turned into a war of attrition, with both sides entrenching themselves along the Western Front. The stalemate along the Marne resulted in a trench warfare system that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers faced unimaginable conditions: mud, rats, lice, constant artillery bombardment, and the ever-present threat of gas attacks. The front lines barely moved for years, and even small gains were often followed by high casualties. This grim reality of trench warfare would become one of the defining features of the Great War. The conditions on the Western Front were mirrored on the Eastern Front, where fighting was far less concentrated but just as brutal. Russia, though facing internal instability and logistical challenges, fought against the Central Powers, primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Russian army, despite having a large number of troops, was poorly equipped and suffered heavy losses. Still, the vastness of Russia's territory meant that Germany was forced to split its forces, creating some relief for the Western Front. The war also expanded into other theaters, such as the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The British and French empires called on their colonial subjects to fight in the war, and nations from across the globe found themselves swept up in a conflict that was, in many ways, far from their home shores. The Ottoman Empire, which had been a declining power for decades, sided with the Central Powers, and fought against the Allies in the Middle East, where they sought to retain their hold over crucial territories. While the Allied powers struggled on the front lines, particularly in Europe, the Central Powers, especially Germany, managed to dominate the early stages of the war. The initial German success, particularly in Belgium and France, was due to their advanced military tactics and their ability to deploy highly trained forces. However, the war would soon become more complex and global, as both sides sought to bolster their ranks with new soldiers and resources from their empires. The longer the war dragged on, the more nations would become embroiled, making it truly a world war. The stalemate continued into the winter of 1914, with no major breakthroughs on either side. The Western Front had become a series of trenches, stretching for miles across Belgium and northern France. Life in these trenches was grueling and filled with horror. Soldiers faced not only the constant threat of death from artillery, sniper fire, and machine guns, but also disease, such as dysentery and the flu. The very conditions of trench warfare, mud, filth, and rats, made survival an incredible challenge. With no clear progress and a high human cost, morale began to falter on both sides. It was not just the soldiers who suffered in this early phase of the war. The civilians in the countries involved also faced significant hardships. The war effort required resources from every corner of society. Food shortages, rationing, and rising taxes were just some of the challenges faced by the home front. As the war became more protracted, the cost to civilian life grew as well. Despite the horror and stagnation on the Western Front, the war was not confined to Europe. One of the most significant shifts during the early stages of World War I was the growing involvement of non-European powers. The British Empire and France, with their vast colonial holdings, saw a significant number of soldiers from India, Africa, and other parts of the world sent to fight in Europe. These soldiers faced the same brutal conditions, often in segregated units, and became an essential part of the Allied war effort. In Asia, Japan, which had allied itself with Britain, began to make inroads in the Pacific, capturing German colonies in China and the Pacific Islands. Japan's role in the war helped elevate its global status, and by the end of the conflict, it was a rising power in Asia, setting the stage for future geopolitical dynamics in the region. As the war progressed into 1915 and 1916, the intense fighting on the Western and Eastern fronts continued, but the war was not limited to just the land battles. A new type of warfare emerged: naval warfare. The British Royal Navy, which had long been the dominant maritime power, found itself in conflict with the Imperial German Navy. The Battle of Jutland, fought in the North Sea in 1916, was the largest naval battle of the war and highlighted the strategic importance of control of the seas. The year 1916 marked a turning point in World War I. While the war on the Western Front remained locked in a deadly stalemate, both sides were beginning to feel the strain of a long, drawn-out conflict. With no decisive breakthrough on the horizon, both the Allies and the Central Powers were desperate for a breakthrough, and the bloodshed intensified. The year would see some of the most infamous and costly battles of the entire conflict, battles that would come to symbolize the futile, attritional nature of trench warfare. One of the most notable of these was the Battle of Verdun, which began in February 1916. Verdun, located on the French-German border, became a symbol of French determination and suffering. The German army, under the leadership of General Erich von Falkenhayn, aimed to bleed France white by attacking the city with the goal of inflicting massive casualties. Verdun, for the French, was a sacred place, home to historic fortifications and military significance. The Germans believed that by attacking here, they could break French morale. For the French, it became a battle to hold the line at all costs. Verdun turned into one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war, lasting nearly 10 months. The French and German forces fought over the same stretch of land, with each side suffering horrific losses. The battle was characterized by its brutal attrition, with soldiers living in horrific conditions, underground bunkers, constant shelling, and a lack of supplies. The fighting was often close quarters and vicious, with artillery raining down on the battlefield for days on end. In the end, Verdun would become a symbol of the horrific cost of the war, with each side suffering over 300,000 casualties. The battle proved to be a costly, but ultimately unproductive, conflict for both sides. In the same year, the Battle of the Somme began in July 1916. The Somme was a joint British-French offensive intended to break through the German lines and relieve pressure on the French forces at Verdun. The Allies had hoped that a large-scale offensive would break the deadlock on the Western Front, but the results were devastating. The British launched a massive bombardment of the German trenches, hoping to destroy the enemy's defenses before sending their soldiers over the top. However, the bombardment was largely ineffective, and when the British soldiers advanced, they were met with devastating machine gun fire from entrenched German forces. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1, 1916, became the single bloodiest day in British military history, with over 57,000 British casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. The battle would drag on for months, with the Allies making minimal gains at an enormous cost. By the time the battle ended in November, the Allies had gained just a few miles of territory, but the price had been staggering. Over 1 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The Somme highlighted the brutal futility of trench warfare, where advances were slow, and the cost of human life was enormous. Despite these horrific battles, the war was not just being fought in Europe. The conflict had already spread to colonies and other theaters of war, and in 1916, several key developments would take place outside the main Western Front. The war had drawn in nations from across the globe, from Africa and Asia to the Pacific, as European colonial powers mobilized their empires in support of the war effort. In Africa, the German colonies of East Africa, Southwest Africa, and Togoland became hotbeds of conflict. German forces, although heavily outnumbered, fought tenaciously against the British and their allies. One of the most notable figures in the East African campaign was German General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who managed to wage a successful guerrilla war against the British forces for the duration of the conflict, even managing to keep his forces intact until the end of the war. This lesser-known campaign demonstrated the far-reaching nature of the conflict and the challenges faced by colonial powers. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, which had sided with the Central Powers, was embroiled in a struggle for survival. The British, seeking to weaken the Ottoman Empire and expand their influence, launched several campaigns in the region, including the Gallipoli Campaign. This ill-fated operation, which began in April 1915, aimed to open up a new front by capturing the Dardanelles Strait and eventually forcing the Ottoman Empire out of the war. However, the campaign ended in disaster, with heavy casualties on both the Allied and Ottoman sides. The failure of Gallipoli was a significant blow to the Allies and highlighted the difficulties of fighting on multiple fronts in the war. In 1916, the Arab Revolt, backed by the British, sought to weaken the Ottoman Empire from within. Arab nationalists, led by figures such as T. E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, rose up against Ottoman rule, capturing key cities in the Arabian Peninsula. This revolt, though successful in some areas, was also a complex and fragmented effort, with differing goals and strategies. The Middle Eastern front would continue to be a key area of conflict for the remainder of the war, and the consequences of the Arab Revolt would echo in the region for decades to come. As the war entered its third year, 1917 would prove to be another pivotal year. The conflict continued to escalate, and the global scope of the war became increasingly evident. The Central Powers, especially Germany, were beginning to feel the strain of prolonged warfare. The blockade of Germany by the British Navy was slowly starving the civilian population, and morale was beginning to crumble. At the same time, the Allies were beginning to rally, with new nations joining the fight. The United States, which had remained neutral for most of the war, was eventually drawn into the conflict in 1917. Several factors led to this shift, including the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, and the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which resulted in the sinking of American ships. President Woodrow Wilson, who had initially advocated for neutrality, now called for the United States to join the war, to make the world safe for democracy. The entry of the United States into the war would tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies and provide much-needed resources, soldiers, and morale. As the war entered 1917, the world was on the edge of change. The conflict had already claimed millions of lives, and the end seemed nowhere in sight. In Europe, the battles on the Western Front were at an impasse, with neither the Allies nor the Central Powers making any decisive progress. The brutality of trench warfare continued to wear down the soldiers who were caught in the never-ending cycle of attack, counterattack, and heavy casualties. But, despite the bloodshed, the war was beginning to change, as both the nature of the conflict and the players involved shifted. The United States, which had remained neutral for much of the war, was slowly but surely being drawn into the conflict. Several factors contributed to this shift, the most important being the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Since the beginning of the war, Germany had been using submarines, or U-boats, to blockade Britain and sink any ship that came into British waters. This included civilian ships, and in 1915, the sinking of the British passenger ship Lusitania by a German U-boat killed 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. This incident sparked outrage in the United States, but it was not enough to push the country into war. However, in early 1917, Germany resumed its unrestricted submarine warfare policy, sinking ships without warning, including American merchant vessels. This, coupled with the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, an encoded message sent from the German foreign minister to the German ambassador in Mexico, urging Mexico to ally with Germany and attack the United States, was enough to push President Woodrow Wilson to ask Congress for a declaration of war on April 6, 1917. The United States, which had long held a policy of isolationism, was now fully committed to the Allied cause. The entry of the United States into the war had a profound impact on the conflict. While the US was not yet fully mobilized, its involvement shifted the balance of power. The Central Powers, already stretched thin, now faced the prospect of fighting the Allies with the addition of a fresh, powerful force. More importantly, the United States brought much-needed resources, including food, equipment, and money. The arrival of American troops on the Western Front helped to relieve the pressure on the weary Allied forces, and the promise of additional support gave them a much-needed morale boost. The American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing, began to arrive in France in the summer of 1917. Although the United States was not yet at full strength, the presence of American soldiers brought a new sense of hope to the Allied forces, who had been fighting for nearly 3 years without any real success. The fresh American troops bolstered the exhausted French and British armies, and they would play a crucial role in the final push to victory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, the Central Powers were also facing their own struggles. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were increasingly burdened by the war. Germany, which had started the war with great optimism, was feeling the strain of prolonged conflict. Its resources were dwindling, and the blockade imposed by the British Navy was beginning to starve the civilian population. The German people were growing increasingly disillusioned, and food shortages and economic difficulties made life unbearable for many. On the Eastern Front, Russia, already struggling with internal problems, was on the verge of collapse. The Russian military had suffered devastating losses, and the morale of the soldiers was at an all-time low. In March 1917, widespread protests broke out in Russia, leading to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. The Russian Revolution had begun, and the Russian Empire, once one of the largest and most powerful in the world, was in the process of being overthrown. The instability in Russia led to the eventual withdrawal of the country from the war. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, officially ending Russia's involvement in World War I. This allowed Germany to shift its focus entirely to the Western Front, but the loss of Russian territory, which included valuable resources, was a significant blow to the Central Powers. Nevertheless, the end of the war on the Eastern Front meant that Germany could now concentrate its forces on the Allies, hoping to achieve a final victory before the American troops fully mobilized. By 1918, the war was entering its final phase, but that did not mean the fighting would stop. The Central Powers, despite being weakened, launched a series of offensives in the spring of 1918, hoping to break through the Allied lines before American reinforcements could make a difference. These offensives, known as the German Spring Offensive, were initially successful. German forces made significant gains, but they could not sustain the momentum. The Allies, now bolstered by fresh American troops and improved tactics, began to push back. One of the key turning points came in July 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne. The Germans, having pushed to within miles of Paris, were halted by a combination of French, British, and American forces. The counteroffensive that followed, known as the 100 Days Offensive, saw the Allies begin to push the Germans back along the Western Front. The German forces, exhausted and outnumbered, were unable to hold their ground, and the Allies gained the upper hand. By November 1918, the Central Powers were on the verge of collapse. The Ottoman Empire had already signed an armistice in October, and Austria-Hungary was disintegrating, with nationalist uprisings breaking out across its empire. The German people, weary of the war and facing economic collapse, demanded an end to the conflict. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed, and World War I, which had claimed the lives of millions, finally came to an end. The aftermath of the war was devastating. The map of Europe was redrawn, with empires collapsing and new nations emerging from the wreckage. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war but placed the blame for the conflict squarely on Germany's shoulders. The treaty imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including massive reparations and the loss of territory. This would sow the seeds of resentment that would eventually lead to World War II. For the soldiers who fought in the war, and for the civilians who lived through it, the consequences were far-reaching. As the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, signaling the end of World War I, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The Great War had taken a devastating toll, with millions dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, and a generation forever scarred by the horrors of trench warfare. But while the fighting had stopped, the true consequences of the war were only just beginning to unfold. The end of World War I marked the dawn of a new era, one in which the world would grapple with the political, economic, and social aftermath of a conflict that had reshaped the global order. The most immediate consequence of the war was the collapse of empires. The Ottoman Empire, which had sided with the Central Powers, was dismantled. In the Middle East, former Ottoman territories were carved up by the Allies, creating new nations and sowing the seeds for future conflict in the region. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, too, had disintegrated. What had once been a vast multi-ethnic empire now fragmented into several new states, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Russian Empire, already destabilized by the Revolution of 1917, was replaced by the Soviet Union under the leadership of the Bolsheviks. And, of course, the German Empire, which had been the driving force behind the war, was brought to its knees. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, would officially end the war, but it also placed the blame for the conflict squarely on Germany's shoulders. The treaty, negotiated among the victorious Allied powers, imposed harsh terms on the defeated Central Powers, particularly Germany. Under the treaty, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war, a clause that would have profound consequences in the years to come. In addition to this war guilt clause, Germany was required to make massive reparations payments to the Allied powers, which crippled its economy. The treaty also demanded the disarmament of the German military and the loss of significant territory, including the Saar Basin, parts of Poland, and all overseas colonies. For many Germans, the Treaty of Versailles was a humiliating document. The terms were seen as unjust and punitive, and the war guilt clause, in particular, was viewed as an insult. The treaty's harsh conditions led to widespread resentment among the German population and provided fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root. This resentment would eventually contribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s, as many Germans looked for a leader who could restore the nation's honor and overturn the treaty's humiliating terms. Beyond the specifics of the Treaty of Versailles, the war's aftermath had far-reaching consequences for the global political landscape. The war had shown the world the horrors of modern industrial warfare, and many believed that the cost of another such conflict was too great to bear. The League of Nations was established in the hope of preventing future wars and promoting international cooperation. However, the League's ability to enforce peace was limited, particularly after the United States chose not to join. The absence of a major world power like the US weakened the League, and it would ultimately fail to prevent the outbreak of World War II 2 decades later. The war also left a lasting impact on the global economy. The European economies, particularly those of France, Britain, and Germany, were left in ruins. The war had drained national treasuries, and the cost of reconstruction would be immense. In Germany, the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles further strained the economy, leading to hyperinflation and widespread poverty. In the years following the war, Europe struggled to recover, and the economic turmoil created fertile ground for political extremism, which would be exploited by figures like Hitler and Mussolini. In Russia, the Russian Revolution and the subsequent rise of the Bolsheviks had changed the course of history. The Russian Civil War continued until 1923, as the Bolsheviks fought off various anti-communist forces, ultimately establishing the Soviet Union. The impact of the Russian Revolution would extend far beyond Russia's borders, inspiring communist movements around the world and influencing global politics for much of the 20th century. Socially, the war had transformed societies across Europe and beyond. The death toll of the war was staggering. Approximately 16 million people lost their lives, including both soldiers and civilians. This had a profound impact on the collective psyche of the nations involved. The war's brutality and the staggering loss of life led to widespread disillusionment, particularly among the surviving soldiers who returned home to face a world that had been forever changed. The lost generation, as they came to be known, was a generation that had experienced the trauma of war and found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. The war also had a significant impact on women's rights. With so many men sent to fight on the front lines, women were required to take on new roles in the workforce, particularly in industries such as munitions production and nursing. Women's contributions to the war effort helped to shift societal attitudes toward gender roles, and in many countries, women gained the right to vote in the years following the war. In Britain, for example, the Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted women over the age of 30 the right to vote. In the United States, the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote nationwide. The psychological impact of the war was also profound. The concept of shell shock, which would later be known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, emerged during World War I. Many soldiers who returned from the front lines were unable to cope with the trauma they had experienced, and the psychological scars of the war would continue to affect individuals and society for years to come. The widespread use of chemical weapons, which caused horrific injuries and death, left lasting physical and emotional scars on survivors. The war had also introduced the world to the devastating effects of modern weaponry, including machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and poison gas, all of which would continue to evolve and shape the nature of warfare. The aftermath of World War I was not just a matter of treaties and reparations, it had far-reaching social, political, and economic consequences that shaped the 20th century. The war had altered the global order, weakened old empires, and created new political ideologies that would define the years ahead. While the immediate focus of the peace treaties was on punishing the Central Powers and redrawing national borders, the true impact of the war would be felt in the decades that followed. In Europe, the war's toll on the social fabric was profound. The immense loss of life, both military and civilian, left many communities scarred. Families lost fathers, brothers, and sons, and entire villages and towns were left without their young men. The grief and trauma of the war created a generation that was both physically and emotionally fractured. In the wake of this devastation, many survivors struggled to come to terms with the horrors they had witnessed. The psychological trauma of the war, known at the time as shell shock and later understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, left deep scars that would endure for years. The term, lost generation, was coined to describe the disillusionment felt by those who had lived through the war. The survivors found themselves in a world that seemed to have lost its moral compass. The sense of idealism and innocence that had existed before the war was gone, replaced by a deep skepticism about the future. Many of the young men who had fought on the front lines returned to societies that seemed to have little room for them, both emotionally and economically. The war had disrupted traditional norms, leaving a sense of alienation and confusion in its wake. In addition to the psychological impact, the war had a profound effect on the economic landscape. The European powers, already struggling to maintain their global influence, found themselves financially weakened by the cost of the war. Britain, which had once been the world's leading imperial power, was left in debt, its economy shattered by years of conflict. France, too, faced significant challenges, having suffered widespread destruction during the war, particularly in the industrialized regions along the Western Front. The German economy was in ruins, with hyperinflation and economic hardship taking hold in the years following the war. The imposition of reparations, as outlined in the Treaty of Versailles, exacerbated these economic struggles and created a climate of resentment and unrest within Germany. The economic consequences of the war also played a role in the rise of political extremism in Europe. As the economic situation worsened, many citizens became increasingly disillusioned with traditional political systems. In Germany, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and the resulting economic hardships led to widespread dissatisfaction with the Weimar Republic, which had been established after the fall of the German Empire. In this environment, radical political movements gained traction, with both communists and fascists vying for power. The most significant of these movements was the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In the years following the war, Hitler capitalized on the resentment felt by many Germans toward the Treaty of Versailles and the economic turmoil that had followed. Through a combination of nationalist rhetoric, promises of economic recovery, and scapegoating of minority groups, particularly Jews, Hitler built a political following that would eventually catapult him to power. The Nazi Party's rise was fueled by the economic instability and national humiliation Germany had experienced in the aftermath of the war, and Hitler's regime would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War II. In Italy, the consequences of the war were similarly profound. Though Italy had been on the side of the Allies, the country emerged from the war dissatisfied with the outcome. Despite having fought alongside the victors, Italy was not granted the territorial gains it had been promised, leading to widespread frustration. This discontentment created fertile ground for Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement. Mussolini's rise to power was fueled by the desire for national glory and the promise of restoring Italy's former greatness. Like Hitler, Mussolini used a mixture of nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism to consolidate power and reshape Italy's political landscape. The impact of World War I was also felt in Russia, where the revolution had fundamentally changed the course of history. The collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Bolsheviks marked the beginning of a new era in world politics. The Russian Civil War, which raged on after the Bolshevik takeover, eventually resulted in the establishment of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. The Russian Revolution inspired communist movements around the world, and the Soviet Union would become one of the two superpowers of the 20th century, playing a central role in the Cold War that would follow World War II. The war also had significant social and cultural consequences. In many countries, the war had changed the role of women in society. With so many men away fighting, women were forced to take on new roles in the workforce, working in factories, farms, and offices. In Britain and France, women served as nurses and worked in munitions factories, making crucial contributions to the war effort. This shift in gender roles helped to pave the way for women's suffrage in many countries. In Britain, the Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted women over the age of 30 the right to vote, and in the United States, the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, granted women the right to vote nationwide. The cultural impact of the war was also significant. The war had shattered the old order, and the art, literature, and music of the post-war years reflected the disillusionment and trauma experienced by those who had lived through it. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque, whose novel All Quiet on the Western Front portrayed the grim realities of war, became symbols of the lost generation. In France, the art movement known as Dadaism rejected the rationality that had led to the war, embracing absurdity and chaos as a response to the senseless destruction. The war had shattered the faith in progress and reason, leading to a re-evaluation of the values that had guided European society for centuries. In the aftermath of World War I, the global political landscape was irrevocably changed. The old imperial powers, Britain, France, and Germany, were weakened, while new powers, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, began to emerge. The legacy of World War I continued to reverberate throughout the 1920s and 1930s, with its political, social, and economic consequences shaping the events that led to the outbreak of World War II. The years following the end of the Great War were marked by instability, economic hardship, and the rise of extreme ideologies. The political and social structures that had emerged in the wake of the war were fragile, and the disillusionment of the post-war years left many seeking answers in radical movements that promised to restore national pride, economic stability, and order. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles had left a profound mark on the national psyche. The treaty's harsh terms, including the war guilt clause and the massive reparations payments, caused deep resentment among the German people. The economic consequences were immediate, with hyperinflation ravaging the country in the early 1920s. The German mark, once a symbol of stability, became virtually worthless, and the middle class was hit hardest. Savings were wiped out, and unemployment soared as industries struggled to recover from the war's destruction. The economic turmoil created fertile ground for political extremism. The Weimar Republic, established after Germany's defeat in the war, was weak and lacked popular support. The government was divided, and many Germans, especially the military and the aristocracy, viewed the Republic with disdain. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, capitalized on this discontent, offering a vision of national unity, economic recovery, and the restoration of Germany's former glory. Hitler's platform promised to undo the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the military, and provide jobs for the unemployed. As the Great Depression took hold in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Hitler's message resonated with many Germans who felt abandoned by their government. By 1933, Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazi Party began consolidating power. The establishment of a totalitarian regime marked a turning point in German history and in the history of Europe. The Nazis implemented policies that focused on rebuilding the economy, expanding the military, and promoting nationalism. They also began implementing a campaign of anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for Germany's problems and fostering an atmosphere of hatred and division. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had already taken power in the 1920s, and the rise of fascism was mirrored in other European countries. Mussolini's fascists promoted authoritarian rule, nationalism, and the supremacy of the state. Mussolini's regime focused on the idea of Italian greatness and aimed to restore Italy to its former glory as the Roman Empire. Like Hitler, Mussolini used propaganda to gain popular support and suppress opposition, establishing a dictatorship that would play a key role in the events leading up to World War II. While fascism was on the rise in Europe, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, was also experiencing significant transformation. The Russian Revolution and the subsequent rise of the Bolsheviks had already reshaped Russian society, but Stalin's policies in the 1930s took the country in a new direction. Stalin's regime was characterized by centralization of power, purges of perceived enemies, and the forced collectivization of agriculture. These policies resulted in widespread suffering, including famines and the imprisonment or execution of millions of Soviet citizens. The Soviet Union's rapid industrialization, however, would eventually help it become a major world power. In the United States, the Great Depression of the 1930s had a similar impact, though the political outcome was very different. While fascism gained traction in Europe, the US remained committed to democracy and capitalism. The New Deal, a series of government programs and reforms implemented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, sought to address the economic crisis and provide relief to the American people. However, the global economic instability created by the Depression, combined with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and Asia, contributed to the growing tensions that would ultimately lead to World War II. The rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and the growing instability in Asia, where Japan was expanding its empire, set the stage for global conflict. The failure of the League of Nations to prevent aggression and the appeasement policies adopted by Western democracies allowed fascist powers to expand unchecked. Germany's reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 were all warning signs that were ignored by European powers, particularly Britain and France. These acts of aggression emboldened Hitler, and in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the start of World War II. The legacy of World War I was clear in the events that unfolded in the 1930s and 1940s. The war's aftermath had set the stage for the rise of fascism and communism, and the political instability it caused contributed to the global economic crisis of the Great Depression. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to bring lasting peace, had instead planted the seeds of resentment and anger that would lead to further conflict. The failure of the League of Nations to prevent aggression and the policy of appeasement by Western democracies allowed authoritarian regimes to expand unchecked. As tensions mounted, the world was once again plunged into war. World War II would be even more devastating than the first, with more than 60 million people losing their lives and entire cities being destroyed. But the roots of the conflict could be traced directly back to the unresolved issues of World War I. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic instability, and the rise of radical political movements created a volatile environment that would eventually lead to the outbreak of the deadliest conflict in human history. The horrors of World War II would, in turn, lead to another reshaping of the world order, with the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers and the beginning of the Cold War. But the lessons of World War I, though often ignored, would remain important throughout the 20th century. As the 1930s progressed, the impact of World War I and the subsequent peace settlements continued to shape the global stage. The unresolved tensions, nationalistic sentiments, and ideological struggles of the post-war period laid the foundation for a second, even more catastrophic conflict. Yet, the social, economic, and political legacies of the war didn't just influence Europe, they had far-reaching consequences that reshaped the global order, influencing the rise of powerful new nations and changing the dynamics of international relations. In the wake of World War I, the United States had emerged as a global economic power. The war had disrupted European economies, and with Europe in ruins, the US became the creditor of choice for many nations. The booming American economy, particularly in the 1920s, provided financial aid to rebuild Europe. However, this prosperity was short-lived. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in 1929, affected countries around the world, including the US. The economic collapse undermined international trade, and the repercussions were felt across the Atlantic. While the United States initially embraced isolationism, its role in global politics was far from over. The economic collapse would prove to be a prelude to broader international involvement as the world moved towards World War II. But more pressing at that time were the vast social and political shifts in Europe. The long-term effects of the war, particularly the rise of authoritarian regimes, brought about a new era of tension and conflict in Europe. The consequences of World War I were already having a profound impact on future developments. By the 1930s, a deeply entrenched sense of distrust and bitterness had developed in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to provide lasting peace, only sowed resentment, creating an atmosphere of instability. Nationalism and revenge were core tenets of Adolf Hitler's ideology, and the failed peace negotiations played into his narrative. With the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, Germany began to militarize and aggressively assert itself on the global stage. The policy of appeasement, pursued by Britain and France, ultimately failed to prevent Germany's expansion, leading directly to the invasion of Poland in 1939, which officially began World War II. At the same time, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had consolidated its power, and communism began to spread its influence in various parts of the world. While the Soviet Union was not directly involved in the rise of fascism, the events following World War I set the stage for the ideological divide that would lead to the Cold War after World War II. Stalin's Soviet regime became one of the most influential political powers of the 20th century, contributing to the complex geopolitical landscape that would unfold in the post-World War II era. Meanwhile, Japan, another nation significantly impacted by the war, began expanding its empire across Asia. The devastation caused by World War I had left Japan seeking new opportunities to gain power and influence in the Pacific region. Japan's militaristic ambitions, combined with a desire to expand its control over resources, led to the invasion of China in 1937. This aggression set the stage for Japan's involvement in World War II, where it would become one of the major Axis powers. While Europe and Asia were descending into chaos, the United States, despite its initial neutrality, could not avoid the growing tensions. The US had been instrumental in the formation of the League of Nations following World War I, yet its failure to ratify the treaty left the organization weakened and ineffective. However, the lessons learned from the League's shortcomings would influence US foreign policy, particularly its involvement in establishing the United Nations after World War II. World War I, in its devastating aftermath, had played a role in the eventual creation of the United Nations. The League of Nations, established after the war in an attempt to promote international cooperation and prevent further conflict, ultimately failed due to its lack of enforcement power and the absence of key powers, such as the United States. Nevertheless, the League's creation laid the groundwork for a more robust international organization, the United Nations, UN, which would be established in 1945 after World War II to address the global need for peacekeeping and diplomacy. As Europe spiraled into the turmoil of World War II, the political and economic systems that had been destabilized by World War I were irrevocably altered. The collapse of the old European empires, coupled with the rise of fascism and communism, led to the eventual reordering of the global balance of power. The world was changing, and in many ways, World War I had set the stage for the conflict that would define the following generation. The Treaty of Versailles, despite its intention to ensure lasting peace, had left an embittered Europe, filled with unresolved tensions and divisions that would haunt international relations for years to come. The long-term repercussions of World War I also created the conditions for the formation of new political movements and ideologies that would reshape the global landscape. Nationalism, imperialism, and militarism, principles that had contributed to the outbreak of the war, would continue to dominate world affairs well into the 20th century. These ideologies would foster competition and conflict, leading to another devastating world war that claimed even more lives and further altered the map of the globe. The cultural impact of World War I, too, was lasting. The devastation and loss of life brought about a re-evaluation of societal norms, particularly in the art world. The disillusionment caused by the war was reflected in literature, art, and music. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque, who captured the brutality of the war in his novel All Quiet on the Western Front, embodied the disillusionment felt by a generation that had been shattered by the horrors of war. The war had broken traditional views of heroism and national pride, and this shift in perception was reflected in the changing cultural landscape. World War I had shown the world the true horrors of modern warfare, with its use of new technologies such as tanks, airplanes, and poison gas. The sheer scale of the conflict, with millions dead and whole cities obliterated, left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. The war had ushered in an era of unprecedented violence and destruction, and the lessons learned from that war would shape the way the world dealt with conflict for years to come. As World War I came to an end, the world was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a global order that had been torn apart by 4 years of brutal conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was supposed to bring lasting peace, but in reality, it sowed the seeds for future wars. The harsh conditions imposed on Germany, with its loss of territory, military restrictions, and exorbitant reparations, left the nation humiliated and economically crippled. The treaty's punitive measures not only caused resentment in Germany but also left many other countries in a fragile state, with new borders and economies to rebuild. The war's end also marked the collapse of empires that had dominated Europe for centuries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire all crumbled, replaced by a mosaic of new nations, many of which were plagued by instability and nationalistic tensions. In the Middle East, the fall of the Ottoman Empire created a power vacuum that would lead to future conflicts in the region. In Europe, the redrawing of borders did not always account for ethnic and cultural divides, leading to resentment and the emergence of nationalist movements. The human cost of the war was staggering. Over 16 million people lost their lives, and countless others were wounded, many of them permanently. The war's destruction left entire cities in ruins, and the economic toll on Europe was immense. The global economy, once intertwined through trade and diplomacy, was left fractured. The impact of the war would be felt for decades to come, as countries struggled to recover and rebuild. In the aftermath, the world turned its gaze toward the League of Nations, an international organization created in an attempt to prevent future wars and promote diplomacy. While the League of Nations was a noble effort, it ultimately failed to prevent the rise of fascism and militarism in Europe. The absence of the United States from the League, and its inability to enforce its decisions, weakened the organization's ability to keep the peace. In the end, the failures of the League of Nations would lead directly to the outbreak of World War II, which would prove even more devastating than its predecessor. Despite the grim reality of the Treaty of Versailles and the failures of international diplomacy, World War I did leave behind important lessons. The war changed the way nations viewed conflict, warfare, and the role of diplomacy. The introduction of new technologies, like tanks and airplanes, revolutionized modern warfare, and the horrors of trench warfare left a permanent mark on military strategy and tactics. On a social level, the war brought women into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, sparking changes that would eventually lead to greater gender equality in many countries. The scars of World War I are still visible today, not only in the borders and political structures of many countries but also in the collective memory of the global community. The war marked the end of an era and set the stage for a new world order. As nations rebuilt, the world moved cautiously toward diplomacy, but the unresolved issues and resentments of the war's aftermath would continue to haunt global politics for years to come. World War I, despite its devastation, ultimately shaped the modern world, laying the groundwork for the geopolitical shifts, technological advances, and social changes that would define the 20th century.